One day, two young Mormon missionaries, Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton, prepared to visit and meet with a set number of people to try to convert them to their faith and bring them into their congregation. The more naive Paxton reflects on a pornographic film she recently watched, saying it made her feel pity for those in the video, as their lives seemed wicked and aimless. Barnes appears to be the more experienced and successful missionary. She has already converted at least 7 people into their faith. The two girls set off on their mission, stopping passers-by to talk about Christ. However, few people pay attention to them. One girl even mocks Paxton, pulling off her skirt to check whether Mormon women wear the magical garments. Nevertheless, the girls persist and continue visiting those who had previously shown interest in their church. Reaching another house on their list, they tie their bicycles to the fence and head toward the door just as a thunderstorm begins. Knocking and hearing sounds that indicate someone is home, the girls wait for the door to open. Soon, an elderly, smiling gentleman, Mr. Reed, appears on the doorstep. The girls explain the purpose of their visit and inquire whether a woman is present in the house, as per the community's requirement that two young sisters only enter homes where a woman is present. Mr. Reed assures them that his wife is home and currently in the kitchen, baking a pie. He sweetly and unintrusively invites the girls inside, takes their coats, and asks whether they mind that the walls of his house are paneled with metal. The sisters assure him that they do not mind. Mr. Reed asks the missionaries to sit and wait for his wife and her blueberry pie, which sounds very tempting to the girls, who are soaked and cold from the rain. He himself heads deeper into the house to call his wife. Left alone, the girls look around the room, noticing the old-fashioned decor, embroidery on the walls, and outdated figurines. However, the presence of family photos reassures them. Soon, Mr. Reed returns, again promising that his wife will come shortly, and he invites the girls to sit at the table and enjoy some drinks. The three sit and begin discussing faith and religion. The man takes an interest in the girls' personal lives, and they share a bit about themselves and how they came to their faith. Mr. Reed demonstrates his knowledge of Mormon teachings by producing their key religious book. Suddenly, he brings up Sister Barnes's late father and makes an insensitive remark, for which he immediately apologizes. Paxton, in response, admits that after death, she would like to become a butterfly and land on the hand of someone dear to her. At that moment, a few lamps suddenly go out. Reed blames it on the old house's faulty wiring. Then he asks for permission to pose an awkward and even unpleasant question. The girls agree to discuss tough topics, as that is what they came for, but his question about Mormon polygamy makes them feel uncomfortable. Mr. Reed presses on with the topic, and Barnes explains that polygamy was a necessary spiritual mission during the early years of their church when many deaths occurred. To grow their congregation, the church allowed men to have multiple wives, as their children were born into the faith. Reed confesses that he fears the church's founder merely used this as an excuse to cover his promiscuity. Barnes argues back, and Reed concludes that what matters most is one's personal relationship with God. Suddenly, Reed shifts the religious discussion to the usefulness of fast food. Paxton lights up at this, building an imaginary ladder where at the top sits what she believes to be the tastiest food. Unexpectedly, Reed compares this to religion. It turns out he has never found a faith that sits at the top of his ladder. Through his exploration, he has realized a truth. The more you know, the less you know. He feels overwhelmed by religious fast food, as all preachers claim to hold the ultimate truth. Unfortunately, he admits, he has finally found the true religion. Although the situation grows tense, the girls still hope for a peaceful resolution and again ask Mr. Reed to call his wife. The man leaves, and Barnes suggests they run away, especially after noticing that the scented candle on the table smells like blueberry pie. At that moment, Mr. Reed returns and invites the girls to the kitchen to meet his wife. He goes ahead, but Barnes stops at the doorway, pretending to take a phone call from their church elder, promising that they will be back soon. The girls try to leave, but Barnes suddenly remembers that their bicycles are locked and the keys are in the pocket of her coat. Nevertheless, they attempt to open the door, but the lock is shut. Barnes asks Paxton to climb out the window, but it's too small, and their phone calls won't go through. To make matters worse, the light in the room goes out completely. The girls are forced to go deeper into the house where the lights are still on and music is playing. Reed seems pleased that they've finally come in, but Barnes requests permission to leave his home, saying they received a call instructing them to return. The man pretends to have just remembered their coats and hands them over. Barnes immediately discovers that her key is missing. Suddenly, it turns up in Paxton's pocket. Barnes asks him to open the front door, but Reed explains that it's on a timer and no one will be able to open it until morning. However, he suggests they can leave through the back door. Noticing the girls' hesitation, he expands on the idea that everyone is free to choose their own path. And by the way, he knows they couldn't have received a call because, as he mentioned earlier, the metal in the walls blocks cellular signals. Barnes decides to end the argument and asks which of the two doors they can leave through. Reed seems confused. The doors are identical, except one says faith and the other unbelief. Suddenly, he asks whether they still believe that his wife is in the next room. After all, everything points to the opposite. The man launches into a philosophical monologue about religion and faith. He placed the blueberry pie scented candle on the table because he wanted them to reflect on things they believe in, simply because someone told them to. Barnes makes a decision and heads for the faith door. However, when she opens it, she sees a staircase leading down to the basement. She turns to the second door, but there is no visible exit there either. At the same time, the church elder begins to worry about the girls. Barnes, meanwhile, pleads with Reed to let them go peacefully, warning him that the church knows their route and will soon find them. However, Reed invites them to discuss the matter of choosing the correct door. He sits the missionaries back at the table, suddenly pulls out the game Monopoly, puts on a record, and continues his story. He argues that half the people who bought the game never finished playing it. Then he mentions another game, The Landlord, which is nearly identical to Monopoly in its main principles. Reed tells the girls the history of these games, which leaves them bewildered, but he simply wants to explain his ideas more clearly. He restarts the same song that was playing earlier and resumes the conversation. There are three monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Each, he claims, is like a well-known game, where Christianity is Monopoly. Mr. Reed once again shifts their attention to the song, recounting how its creators went to court over accusations that another famous band had stolen their melody. The girls are now thoroughly confused but have no choice but to listen. Reed concludes that repeated iterations distort the original message, eclipsing it. Judaism, he argues, is the original religion, yet it has the fewest followers. Why? To him, missionaries are sellers of religion, and by letting them into their homes, people engage in a conversation about buying and selling ideology. At this point, Reed turns off the lights. Using the beam of a flashlight, he points to the paintings on the walls and begins to explain that sacred texts revered by people are merely retellings of stories passed down orally by ancient people. The story of a savior who performed miracles, he adds, was already popular long before his birth. Meanwhile, the church elder is walking through neighborhoods searching for the girls, but no one has seen them. Reed continues his tale, mentioning the old gods who were predecessors of Jesus. He also draws parallels between Christian and Mormon mythology, comparing them to Star Wars, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, completely confusing the girls. Reed concludes that if God exists and people are wholly dependent on him, it is terrifying. But if he does not exist and they are left to fend for themselves, that is equally terrifying. Thus, the church is either truth or a lie. Now, he tells them, they can choose the doors. Paxton, utterly terrified, urges Barnes to go through unbelief just to escape, but Barnes suddenly heads for the first door, convinced that Reed won't let them leave. She believes he wants to prove some truth that only he understands. Right now, it's essential to show her faith. The girl fervently dismantles the conclusions Reed previously made about the similarities between religions. They believe in God and decide to go through the first door, leaving it to him to decide their fate. The girls find themselves in a dark basement, the only window barred. Barnes manages to tear off a plank, but at that moment, they hear the door open and someone entering. Barnes hands Paxton a letter opener she grabbed earlier and tells her to stab Reed because he wouldn't expect it from her. Their code phrase will be a reference to the magic garments. However, instead of Reed, a strange figure enters the basement, places a pie on the table, and sits quietly nearby. Music begins to play from upstairs, and the girls discover a listening tube connecting the dungeon to the study. Sitting at his desk and carving wooden figurines, Reed announces that the figure with them is a living prophetess. The girls will serve as witnesses to a true miracle. Before their eyes, the prophetess will eat a poison pie and die, but then she will resurrect. Horrified, the girls watch the process. Reed then instructs them to confirm that the woman's heart has stopped beating, which they reluctantly do. Now all that remains is to wait for her resurrection. At that moment, the church elder rings the doorbell, searching for the girls. Reed locks all the interior doors so the elder cannot hear their cries, and the bicycles have disappeared. In desperation, the girls pull a carpet toward the door to retrieve a box of matches lying on it. Meanwhile, the elder leaves and Reed returns to his study, but then the doorbell rings again. Barnes finds the box of matches. Standing at the door once again is the church elder. Downstairs, the girls notice that the prophetess seems to have moved slightly. The elder hands Reed a church pamphlet and leaves. The girls attempt to light the matches but are horrified to see the prophetess suddenly regain consciousness. She shares a vision of the afterlife. When Reed returns, he asks the girls to describe what they saw, ready to record their testimonies as evidence of the existence of the afterlife. Paxton repeats fragmented words about angels, and Reed insists that he will show them God by killing them. but it will only be temporary, as they too will resurrect. Barnes, however, suddenly claims that she experienced clinical death at the age of 4. She describes seeing the same blinding white light, clouds, and an overwhelming desire to return. She declares that this is not a prophecy, it's a typical near-death hallucination. He killed the woman for nothing. At this moment, Barnes gives Paxton the signal to attack, but before Paxton can act, Reed unexpectedly slashes Barnes' throat. Paxton runs upstairs, screaming and banging on doors. Realizing it's futile, she returns to find Reed sitting next to Barnes' body. He declares that Barnes will return from the dead and removes a metallic object from her hand, claiming it as proof that she was artificial and that they all exist inside a simulation. Paxton recognizes the object as a contraceptive implant and argues that his theory cannot be proven. Reed agrees, but points out that this is true of all religions. You either believe or you don't. Paxton accuses Reed of orchestrating the entire scene and swapping out the prophetess's body when the doorbell rang. She noticed that the prophetess was sitting in a different pose. The second woman must have entered through a hidden door and replaced the dead one to deliver a pre-scripted account of the afterlife, adding a phrase Reed hadn't planned, that it was all a lie. To cover up his failure, Reed killed Barnes. Determined to expose the truth, Paxton finds a hidden passage leading out of the basement, but she ends up in an even darker dungeon where she discovers the attributes of demonic rituals. Finally, she spots a door locked with a heavy padlock. To her surprise, the key in her pocket, which she thought was for the bicycle locks, fits perfectly. The girl opens the door and is horrified to find wooden cages where women are held in appalling conditions. Reed catches up to her and demands to hear her conclusions about the one true religion. Paxton realizes that from the moment they entered the house, Reed took their keys, unlocked the bicycles, and hid them. He orchestrated everything to prove that the only real religion is the desire to control others. Reed approves of her conclusion and explains that he keeps these women here because it is their choice. Paxton, too, has spent her life obeying orders. Even the church decided what underwear she would wear, the magic garments. Hearing the code phrase, Paxton stabs Reed in the neck with the letter opener and tries to escape through the unbelief door, but she finds herself back in the same dungeon where Barnes's body lies. Reed, fatally wounded, catches up to her and stabs her in return. Bleeding out, Paxton begins to pray, not for herself, but out of mercy. Just as Reed prepares to finish her off, Barnes rises and delivers a fatal blow to Reed with a wooden plank before collapsing and dying once more. Paxton manages to escape to freedom, but as she stops on the street, a butterfly briefly lands on her hand, a poignant echo of her earlier wish to transform into a butterfly and visit those she loves.